Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. Before, during, after. That's the title of the book we'll be talking about today. And the author of that book, Richard Bausch, is with us, and the book is published by Alfred A. Knopf. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
I understand by looking at the notes from the publisher that this is your 29th book.
No, 20th.
20? Oh, I must have misread.
Yeah.
Well, that's still rather prolific, I think.
Well, next to my friend Joyce Carol Oates, it's a drop in the bucket.
Oh, well. Well, you can keep trying.
Yes, indeed. I got a long way to go to catch up with that lady. She's an amazing writer.
Yeah. What you've done here is you've told the story of a love affair that kind of blooms and then falters or falls upon fallow times against the background of a national tragedy. It's in the wake of 9/11. And somewhere in a different interview, you said that you felt that novels often are connected to historic events or ought to be.
I think what I was talking about was that the way I tell my students that if you're writing a novel and you want to try to arrive at some sort of truth about human experience, then the history, no matter what it is backdrop. Like, it's not really, War and Peace isn't really about the Napoleonic Wars. It's about that family, the Rostovs, and the other family, the Bolkonskis, and what goes on. And what goes on is terribly personal. And my favorite example of that is Natasha sitting in the window, and her lifelong friend Sonia says, "Look, Natasha, Moscow's burning." And Natasha thinks she's never going to see Prince Andrei again, and she looks over her shoulder at Moscow and says, "Oh, yes, Moscow." That somehow that's so moving, even while he does deliver the conflagration and the burning and all the rest of it.
Yes, yes. In your book, one of the things that struck me as I was reading it, the story of 9/11 is, I guess you could say, the historic event that's in the forefront. And obviously that tells acts of terrible, terrible violence. It killed a lot of people. And at the same time, you're telling a story of a different kind of violence, the violence of rape.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how you saw the connection of those. I mean, at certain times, as a reader, I was equally overwhelmed. I mean, by the personal violence and then by the cosmic violence, if you will.
I think that I actually, when I began to see it as a novel, began to think that about how each of us has our own personal catastrophe. I mean, for everyone that was directly involved in that terrible event, of course, it was terribly personal, and it's still something everybody who was involved in it is having to try to find a way to live with. But that these kinds of public traumas happen in such a way that one's own private traumas can actually take a kind of precedence. I mean, there's a place where she remembers the burning cities right after she's been raped, and she has the thought, "Oh, yes, that." But what she's really thinking about is what's just happened to her. It's the next thing she thinks is there wasn't enough water in the world to get clean. I mean, she's trying to just,
Yeah, she's in the shower for a long time.
And all the water is on in the sink and in the shower, and it's just this frantic trying to get clean, trying to wash it all away from her.
You also follow not just Natasha, of course, but other people. One of them is a fellow by the name of Falk, Father Falk, as the story starts, and then he becomes a layperson. And he reflects, you write, Falk, is in a cab. The cab pulls out in traffic, and for a little space, Falk gazed at the back of his head, watching him negotiate the crowded lanes with a measure of aggressiveness, muttering low at other cars, attending to everything as if he were alone. At length, Falk sat back, determined to ignore him. He saw the shifting view of the street and the other people in the cars they passed. Massachusetts Avenue, there in D.C., a couple in one car was laughing at something, the woman gesturing and nodding, the man holding up one hand as if to surrender. How could anyone find a way back to light-heartedness? This abysmal day had brought everything of normal life into question. What could be left of banter, jokes, silliness? He knew that this thought was irrational and that people would go on being people. Long ago he had learned to cultivate a healthy distrust of his own thinking when he was in the grip of anxiety. And I think that's the way many people felt. You know, how can you get back to anything like normal from this day, this 9/11 day?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it took the smiles away for, that it was a very, very hard thing. And when you looked at, the shows that were on TV that were supposed to be all about comedy, I mean, Jon Stewart wept and gave off a diatribe about the violence and the evil of this kind of abstract hatred of entire peoples, and it was, everyone who was, grown and alive at the time, it's one of those things you never forget. I was in New York, so.
Mm-hmm. I was here. There are many unusual things, I think, in before, during, after, that we can talk about. One of the things that I would like to talk about when we come back is the role of Thomas Aquinas in your story. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Before, during, after. It's a novel by Richard Bausch, who's joined us today on Conversations on the Coast. And the novel is published by the publisher whose name we always like to say, Alfred A. Knopf. Now, never before in my experience interviewing novelists have I been able to pose this question. Please tell me why you've got Thomas Aquinas' writings or imitations of his writings in this book, please?
I knew that this character had an interest in him, even though he's Episcopal rather than Catholic, but that what he liked about it when he was young is a great deal what I liked about it, which was this amazingly calm, ordered sort of explanation of everything that had to do with, this theology, with the...
Yeah.
And I always loved the simple progression of these thoughts as Aquinas would lay them out. So I had put that in there, and I had, of course, in my library, I have the Summa Theologica, and it suddenly hit me. This guy's becoming so discombobulated and obsessed with his anxiety about what happened in Jamaica that, this will be cool. So I took the Aquinas out and looked at it and then set up, and it's almost the same kind of language.
I have a page right in front of me, beginning section or chapter 7, and the first thing is an article, Article 4, whether it is justified to seek answers by confronting people outside the marriage. And that goes on, and then the next thing you see, and this is typical, Objection 1, followed by Objection 2. And then a paragraph which begins, as they all do, on the contrary. And this was this syllogistic reasoning? Is that what that was called?
I don't really know. I just know that it always impressed me, and it's so he poses the question and then answers it, and gives the objections to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember one of the first ones is, Article 1, it would seem that God is simple. And then he goes on to show that somehow, that in his theology this is true. By the way, before he died, he said it was all dust. He didn't believe in it at all anymore. I mean, he believed in God, and he was a saint, but everything he had written, he said it was dust. It was nothing but dust. It hadn't touched it, hadn't come close to it. This enormous document upon which, so many people have. It's one of the great works of the world's literature.
It certainly is. Yes.
And but it was also. It afforded me an opportunity to give time passing in it, so that I didn't have to do a progression of scenes. I could actually have him summarize how the weeks had been.
Yeah. What the situation is plot-wise. Yeah. In what I still think is called a syllogism. I don't know. I don't know. Now, this is not a two-character novel. It's got many. And my favorite character, I suppose, minor character, is Iris Mara. Tell us about dear Iris.
Yeah, Iris is Natasha's grandmother. I don't know where she comes from. I made her up out of whole cloth.
Okay.
In fact, I didn't know that she had worked in the mayor's office until I was in the third or fourth draft of the book. And you
had to get her employed, I suppose.
Well, I'm thinking, how does Natasha have this job with Senator Norland? How could she have gotten this job? And then constructing it all, I thought, oh yeah, sure. Iris Mara is a progressive old lady who spent her life, trying to help people and working for the mayor's office. And I wanted her to have a social life, and I didn't want them to be too reclusive. Although she talks about how they spent many nights alone in the quiet, just the two of them reading, and somebody would have supposed there was something between them that was wrong, but they were perfectly happy just to be in each other's company.
Yeah. And she is just one great grandmother, I think.
Yeah, and she's also the one who manages to bring them together by just insisting that they go through the forms of what they've always known. Let's help me get breakfast, and we're going to say grace, and all of that.
Yeah.
If I were to film that, that's what it would be. There would be a long sequence where there was no talk at all, just the sound of them moving those things around in the kitchen, getting breakfast ready. Yeah,
and the eggs being scrambled, and then the bacon popping on the stove. Yeah, that'd be great. All because of Iris, I think.
Yeah, just like the end of that wonderful movie, Big Night, when they make that meal. It's such a cool moment. I don't know if I was consciously thinking of it, but after it was written, I thought, oh yeah, it's like Big Night. When they...
Sounds familiar to me. Oh well. Now there is another woman, minor character whom I didn't like. I think she's a nasty person. I almost said a word I shouldn't say. The only name that I can remember that she has is Constance.
Constance Waverly.
Well, Constance starts out by doing a very nice thing for Natasha. She promises her a free vacation in Jamaica. But boy, after that, she goes crazy.
Yeah, and her craziness is of course priggish, and is. I didn't think of this until much later, but it's exactly the kind of thing that victims of that crime sometimes get from women. It's a very strange thing. I learned a lot about the ways of this culture where all that's concerned. I mean, it's not a coincidence that. Let me put it a different way. It wasn't an accident, particularly that those two idiots on the Republican side of the aisle were saying those ridiculous, stupid things about rape. Then we had an election where somebody says the rape guy lost, and on the Republican side, and somebody had to say which one, because there were a couple of them. We were just And one of them who said that the woman's reproductive system shuts down.
Oh,
during a race.
yes, I remember
that guy's the
line.
chair of the science committee, for God's sakes, in the House. I mean, how in the world? That guy's anything but, you know.
We have to take a break here, but when we come back, we'll get back to the truth of this fiction. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Richard Bausch is with us today on Conversations on the Coast to talk about his latest novel and 20th book. It is called Before, During, After, and it's published by our friends at Alfred A. Knopf. An early reviewer writing in something called Booklist says, in part, sublimely probing what it means to lose trust in oneself and in those one loves. The masterful Bausch delicately ponders the consequences of devastating loss on both a grand and personal scale. There's the business between 9/11 and what happens to these individual characters. A luscious, sweeping heartbreak of a novel. I don't know about the luscious, but I agree with the heartbreaking.
I'm happy about the luscious, though.
I know
like
you should be. It kind of relieves some of the heartbreak. Yeah. The main characters of this book are Natasha and Michael Falk. But before there was a Michael Falk, there was a Leander Falk, who is a strange piece of work for being the father of an Episcopal priest, I think.
Yeah, well, part of that comes with the conflicts in the home. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Michael is figuring out after 20 years that maybe this isn't what he's supposed to be doing with his life, that it was a form of refuge against the conflicts in that house growing up where, you know, the old man's covenant was with the next hour in the day. And he had this woman who was steeply religious and observing all of the various forms, but also capable of a kind of relentless priggishness that you know you often find in people who are conscious of themselves as being terribly devout. I guess it's you know my grandmother was very devout and probably the single most tolerant human being I've ever been around. She never touched a drink of alcohol, and she would sit there and watch us all drink wine and whiskey and beer and just sitting around partying and everything. Mm-hmm. We weren't lushes or anything, but there was plenty of it going around in a family with men and everybody having a good time watching a ball game or something. She never said a thing. The only thing she ever said to me once, when I was talking about evolution, she said, "You need to read your catechism," but she said it so sweetly with a tiny little laugh. You know?
What a theologian, huh?
I know.
Now, Michael, the son of Leander, is an interesting guy, and you've just suggested something that I didn't pick up when I read the book, that possibly he went into the priesthood as a way to escape. And there are a lot of religious vocations that take form from that, aren't there?
Yeah, it's true. It is. I remember wanting to go. I read Thomas Merton's The Sign of Jonas about his first years in the Trappist monastery. I was 18 years old, and I wanted to go to a Trappist monastery. Mm-hmm. And didn't recognize at the time that what I really wanted to do was get away from all the complications of being 18 and trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do.
Well, one of the good things that happens to Michael, I think, is that he meets Natasha at a point in her life when she's relatively free.
Yeah.
And sparks fly. And it's very beautifully told, very tastefully done. And then there's Jamaica, which is horrible. Yeah. Horrible.
Yeah. And she tries to do what 70% of the victims of that crime try to do, 7 out of 10. Try to live past it and pretend it never happened. And but she's got this, this trauma in her, and that she can't shake. This anxiety that keeps coming at her.
Yeah.
And
the closest she comes to doing something about it is one phone call.
Yeah.
To a police department in Orlando, Florida.
Yeah. And that police officer is named after one of my favorite professors, Lorraine Brown. She's no longer with us, but I wanted to put her here because every book I did, she read and wrote me a nice note about it. She's a great teacher, great lady.
How wonderful. I don't think I've ever done this before, but I'm going to read, with your permission, the closing paragraph of the book. This is when the bacon is cooking and the eggs are being scrambled.
Okay.
Natasha saw the worry in his expression, the frowning anticipation. Without words, she had the rush of knowing. They were living in the new, terrible reality. War and broken expectations and suspicion and rape and masses of people dying for nothing they had done, even from a thing as harmless as the mail. And she had been frightened that she had lost him forever. And here he was, at her grandmother's table, the family table, not lost, an essentially good man carrying the weight of his blunders and failures of faith or understanding, a man full of inconsistencies and anxiety, subject to the terrors of the time, and withal someone who desired to be better than that, and who might even find a way to make up for the things he had done and felt out of his anguish, and perhaps through the long and difficult, and she understood this too, doubtful journey back, she might find again the man she'd fallen in love with, the one with whom she had been so happily at ease, so much at home, the one whose child she was carrying. "There's something else I have to tell you," she said. That's the end of a very wonderful novel. Richard Bausch has written it. It's called Before, During, After. I suggest you run right out and buy a couple of copies. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.